All right, we're on to session 3 here, and that means question 4. We already looked at the first 3 questions, and question 4, if I can hit the right computer, is this. Right here, does this imply an objective natural theology or only a subjective natural theology, whereas only the natural revelation is objective? You hear that all the time, the desire to separate those, natural revelation from natural theology, and that's kind of why I'm asking it in that way. And the simplest way to come to this fourth question is by summarizing what we've already gathered from our first 3 answers. Let's just do a little bit of review. I'll say it like this. According to Paul, there is intelligible divine communication, answer 1, about various divine attributes. Answer 2, to all mankind. And then from answer 3, that is both internal to the soul and by means of the external world. Now, stated in this way, all we're speaking about is revelation proper. It's the moment that we step over the line from God's act of communication to man's act of, and then how do we end that sentence? Because everything's uncontroversial before that, but there ends the ceasefire. Man's act of what? How do we end the sentence? Bardians, Vantillians, and adherents to Reformed epistemology all ready themselves to pounce the moment we end the sentence with man's activity. There is, to be sure, a redeemed natural theology. I've mentioned it already in Bavinck and Van Til. We'll come to that. But at this point, all we've observed is Paul's language about something which all mankind receives from God. And this is really why we're starting with Scripture, because you can't get around that first principle, that Paul's talking about something that all mankind receives from God. The question then is that which is received by all mankind some real set or unit of knowledge, or isn't it? Our question is not whether sinful man does a single decent thing with it. The question is purely and simply whether that which is understood as an object of knowledge in its own right, is it true knowledge of God? Now, admittedly, there's other complex questions which can muddy up the water here. For example, in the clause in verse 19, what may be known about God, I'm going the wrong way. What may be known about God, in verse 19, assuming that's the best translation, the word may. If you have that translation, you could say, well, that can mean different things. It could be taken to suggest that this knowledge is, number 1, total and equal in each person. Now, I have total and equal up here, total yet unequal down here, but then from birth over here, and then over time, you can kind of see why that tetrad is, broken up that way with that guy right in the middle. You could take that in 4 different ways. Total and equal in each person from birth, total and equal in each person presented throughout the course of their lives. Does he mean total yet unequal from birth? Total yet unequal presented throughout the course of their lives. And along these same lines, we might reconsider whether such knowledge can only be of principles, or is it also conclusions? That's huge, and the reason it was huge, I just mentioned it, the whole discursive reasoning thing. We can consider whether the things of God are perceived in or through his works in nature, whether that excludes reflection upon them. And we've seen that the reason for these exclusions is that to move from that which is revelation proper to rational reflection, whether those inferences be induction from data to conclusions by, say, a scientist, or deduction from premises to conclusions, say from some moral law to its implication. That belongs to discursive reasoning, so that the human mind is seen to be, by those who are worried about that, seen to be the source, and not divine communication being the source. And that last point is perhaps the chief error so widely and uncritically assumed, that my whole thesis is meaning to challenge. Because it's sheer relativism to equate the mode of human reason's discovery with the source, much less with the content of the truth that is so discovered. Now, the modern Orthodox Christian, if he's conservative, has dug in his heels hard, and rightly so, against the rationalist, if we're defining rationalist properly, because he exalted reason as the determiner of truth. And we've done that so hard that too many Christian schools of thought swung the pendulum all the way over to demoting reason, even below the discoverer of truth. So reason is not the determiner of truth, but it is the discoverer of truth. What else are you going to discover it with your toe? So what else is a man illuminated by and with and in? How is he animated by revelation but by reason? But if you removed his cursive reasoning from the picture of knowing this revelation in any active sense of reason, then even the principles can't really arrive as intelligible principles. We sort of hinted at that. The data, how's that an idea? Innate ideas, how does that constitute knowledge? The notion that these can constitute knowledge, or intuition for that matter, that this can constitute knowledge apart from acts of thought, seems to be the position that really bears the real burden of proof. Knowledge is always about something, and specifically something distinct from the knowing subject. If it is true knowledge, then it is an object of the mind, an object independent of each finite mind, or else we're left with subjectivism. At any rate, one commentator, Colin Kruse, if I'm pronouncing that right, in his commentary to Romans, he says about verse 19 this: the word translated known is found only here in Paul's writings, but 14 times elsewhere in the New Testament. And in every case it refers to something that is known or being made known, not something that may be known. This word noston, it's familiar, you see that. It's very similar to gnosis, obviously coming from the same word. It's not modified, it's not paired with a subjunctive verb. And so I would add to Kruse's remarks those of Charles Hodge, that this, quote, always in the Bible means what is known, not what may be known. Kind of treats it as hypothetically, out there. The NASB rendering, that which is known, is therefore preferable to the inclusion of maybe in the ESV, the NIV, and even the King James. This is not merely a latent capacity. It's not a hypothetical package of knowledge which the Holy Spirit unpacks for you later at regeneration. Certainly he does unpack it in the sense of going further and so forth, but that's not really what they mean. This is real knowledge, wherever it holds sway, and Paul makes it a communication to the human reason as human reason. Now, going to the next slide, another commentator, Longenecker, takes this view in saying, quote, we may conclude that Paul is not merely speaking of people having observed certain data having to do with God's eternal power and divine nature, or more minimally that such data is available for all to see, but that all people have also had and continue to have some appreciation or understanding of the significance of that data for their own lives. We could put a crucial early piece of the puzzle in place. I have that there. I want to expand on that picture in a very simple way. Let's get some simple graphs coming up here. You see, this is the object of the mind. Whatever attribute of God is being contemplated through something in nature, the circle represents that object of mind, what Paul's talking about. What's reflected in there, that's just going to represent the medium that it comes to us in. You kind of see it's stuff from the world, but it's all those created things through which we see, and ultimately this object of mind is putting things together. In a sense, it's bigger than those parts of the world. But now, this object of the mind is now here in mind 1 and mind 2. Notice that I'm calling that A. If you're familiar with some basic logic, you'll often represent the basic laws of logic, like the law of identity, law of non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle with the letter A. So, for example, the notated way to say it is the law of identity, that's A equals A. Law of non-contradiction, A does not equal non-A. Law of the excluded middle, A or non-A. So here you have A. And that means here you have A, and here you have A. Now, somebody could say to that, no, you've got a really, really fuzzy A, or you've got B, or you've got non-A. Well, we'll come to that. But this knowledge of God must have the following attributes. It must be, number one, an object of the mind. Remember, if the relationship between this and this is totally equivocal, then that means there's no relationship between them, and therefore this is not knowledge. But that's not what Paul says. Now, on the other extreme, we're not saying that it's univocal. We're not saying that this A perfectly represents all that God has said over here. So it must be neither of those extremes. This is just classic Thomist, even Aristotelian analogy. This is sufficiently like unto this for that knowledge to be real knowledge. Number one, it has to be an object of the mind, object A. Two, its truth is external to all finite minds, independent, antecedent of them. This was already true before each and every finite mind conformed to it. You see that? That's crucially important. This is already true. We did not make it true, nor did its truth start in our minds. It was already true. It was an object of truth. Number three, each truth known by and in finite minds implies the conformity of such minds to that truth. So reason is conforming to revelation. Okay? Number four, no such truth can be true in one mind and false in another at the same time and in the same relation. That's why I called it A. If you say, well, mind too, he's got a totally different idea in his mind, well, then that would be B. But it certainly cannot be. Now let's say, well, mind too totally contradicts here. Well, then fine, he's wrong, and we would call that non-A. We would not say that this is both A over here and non-A over here. It wouldn't be the same this. That's why the A, the referent, is so important to lock or to fix your mind on at this point. So these are the two subjective circles, meaning the mind, the knowers. This is the objective circle, the thing known. It's got to have all those. But then I would say it's got to have another thing. Number five, it's got to have this. As we move to another picture, a fifth attribute is that this situation we just saw in the fourth attribute, it has to be the same in each mind. Now I'm just going to put the words, instead of mind one and mind two, I'm going to put regenerate over here and unregenerate over here. So if you said amen, yes, thumbs up to the fourth criteria, well, then you ought to say the same for the fifth. Why would it change to say, well, this guy's unregenerate? Well, because if he's unregenerate, he's going to mean B or non-A. Sure. But when he says A, that A cannot be true in one mind and false in another. Nor can it be true in a religious-y way and false in a rational way, or vice versa. Very, very crucial. And if the pennies didn't drop for you right there, well, we'll just keep hammering at the same point. An immediate objection to the method that we're using here can be anticipated. Why just focus on Romans 1, 19 and 20? Why not expand the circle from verse 20 to not only 19, why not include verse 18? And while we're at it, why not include the rest of the chapter? You see, opponents of the classical view may have a particular interest in this, given how Paul speaks of the same mankind, these guys, suppressing the truth in unrighteousness, verse 18, and then exchanging every bit of that divine truth to form idols and commit all manner of sin. That's verses 21 through 32. We agree. We agree wholeheartedly that all mankind by nature does indeed twist all such truth into a lie. However, he cannot do this unless that truth which he twists is not consciously held up under suspicion. Let me give you an example that might help. If you've talked to unbelievers at any length of time, you've probably had an experience like this. When we're in a conversation with an unbeliever about, say, morality, regardless of what occasioned the discussion, there comes a point in the conversation when the unbeliever becomes aware of where things are headed. He may have a number of ways that he wants to head us off at the pass, perhaps change the subject, inject a straw man, something like that. He wants to head us off at the pass. That is, he wants to undermine our contention that wrong implies right, and that right implies a transcendent obligation to a person or to some infinite or transcendent standard, or any number of things that take place in those discussions. Well, now, how does the skeptic come to know that this is where things are headed? What exactly would he mean by this if he were totally destitute of the knowledge of it? If he meant nothing at all, well, then no suspicion of it would ever arise. That's one of the things that Paul means in Romans 1:18 by suppress the truth in unrighteousness. You see what I'm doing with my hands? Why would I do that if I didn't believe there was anything there to do this to? Or that it was dangerous if it got out of its cage? You see what I'm saying? You have to not only sense in some way that you don't really understand anything about, but there's 2, 3, 4, 5 things you know about this thing that you're trying to lock down that functions as the reason that you're trying to lock it down. Now, coming back from examples to the text itself, Luther, in his commentary, takes up the matter of the heathens' idolatry. He says, quote, "They proved this by calling the idols which they made gods," and even God with a capital G. What do pagan religions do but take the very attributes of the true God, his eternity, his power, stuff we're talking about, and isolate them from other divine attributes, or severely restrict them, so that if we could make Luther anticipate Feuerbach or Freud and turn them on their heads, what Luther's really getting at here, and we'll read more of his quote in a second, far from projecting human attributes to the superlative, which is what, Freud and Feuerbach, this projection of human attributes and calling that divine, what the pagan is actually doing is in reverse. But notice what this tells us about this revelation translating into objective knowledge. Luther continues. He says, "This demonstrates that there was in their hearts a knowledge of a divine sovereign being. How else could they have ascribed to a stone or to the deity represented by a stone divine attributes, had they not been convinced that such qualities really belong to God? Manifestly, they knew that God is mighty, invisible, just, immortal, and good. But they erred in ascribing to their idols the divine attributes that belong only to the true God." And that was Luther. And all of this drives us to be more precise in our language about general revelation and about natural theology. Paul, we have to ask about his words. Does he restrict himself to the idea that the knowledge of God is merely the occasion for the unbeliever's guilt? Is it not precisely an object of knowledge that is known? As I said before, not just the occasion, like light hitting a table, the reflection, and the table just sort of doing that. Is it just the occasion of that? Or is it an object of knowledge? In other words, an object with a nature. However much reason may be deliberating on it, there is at some point an object of the mind that is two things. This object of the mind is at once independent of all finite minds. That was that bigger circle. It didn't originate from any of them. And two, beheld by those finite minds, those smaller circles that were taking it in. The idea got through to a degree of clarity sufficient for the conviction. And by conviction here, I mean the guilty conviction at the end of time, at the end of the verse in verse 20. This is what I mean by objective knowledge. Now, from this point, because of sin, all manner of subjective distortions emerge. We read the rest of the chapter. There's no disagreement on that. But we beg to differ with all the theologians or traditions that either conflate the objective with the subjective, or else cancel the objective by the subjective. How do we object? We object in the words of Paul in Romans 3:4. "Let God be true, though every one were a liar." Those objects of knowledge that are God's communication, which they know, no matter how they twist it afterwards. Let God be true, though everyone were a liar. Now, with all of that, how should we best summarize our answer to these four questions? We've come to the end of the 4 questions about Romans 1:19 and 20. Well, here's my own exegetical summary. I'm trying to make it one big run-on sentence, but with these 4 points. Number 1, this is real knowledge about God's nature that is communicated through all created natures. All things in creation are objects with natures. 3, understood by human reason, such that any reflection on this knowledge of God through lesser natures will be a natural theology. God's communication of himself about God is what theology means, through the things that have been made. These are lesser natures. Those natures, that's what we mean by natural theology. In addition to the controversial points already introduced, note also the way in which I'm using the word nature, and in the plural, natures. We'll do a whole chapter on definitions. Not only the way I'm using those words, but relating them to the other words. I have to wait for the following section to justify my definition of those words, but I labor the point to draw it out so clearly that you'd have to be forcing it to disagree with the definition. But I do want to relate those to the exegesis from the start, and that's why I've defined things the way I have. But we do want to get into one other thing before we close this section on Romans 1:19 and 20. The interpretation of this passage by Karl Barth and Cornelius Van Til is a study in the lengths one might go to rid the biblical witness of the usefulness of divine speech in nature. Now, in fairness, they would not have said that the usefulness of divine speech in nature is what they're excluding, but rather its use in our minds or on our tongues or pen. Nevertheless, when our theological weeding projects start to tug at roots that are so firmly fixed in the soil of Scripture, it may be a good signal to reconsider whether these are really weeds that we've identified at all. Now, let me just tackle Barth first and Van Til after. And this is not expansive treatment by any means, but just to give you an idea, for Karl Barth, there's no talk of the true God back behind Christ. Anyone familiar with Barthian theology understands his reasoning for this. After linking the wrath of God in verse 18 to falling nature, this is in Barth's commentary on Romans, and this God, he's accusing anyone who holds to a natural theology. What we make of it is really a no God. It's a weird way of talking. He proceeds from there to define that which may be known about God in verse 19 to be the realization that we do not know him. Kind of like a reverse Socrates. The hidden abyss, Barth calls it. And God's eternal power in verse 20, he defines this to be that which breaks forth in the resurrection. Knowing is made unknowing. General is made specific. So a more lopsided interpretation of Romans 1:19 and 20 can hardly be imagined than the one that Barth gives. Van Til's is not going to be that bizarre, but it's worth looking at nevertheless. There's a statement by Van Til. Now, of course, Van Til doesn't write a commentary on Romans, so you got to go through all of his works to glean something, anything. But he does make a comment on Romans 1:20, which is ambiguous at best, an absurd stretch in the name of fideism at the worst, but it's found in his introduction to systematic theology, where he grants the traditional breakdown between general revelation and special revelation. The former communicates God's existence, and the latter reveals salvation in Christ, but he then adds, quote, "On the other hand, it is also true that when man was created in paradise, he knew not merely of the existence of God, but he knew the nature of God as far as it had been revealed to him. It is for the loss of this actual knowledge of the nature of God that man, when he became a sinner, must be held responsible. It is for that original loss of," and he's commenting on Romans 1:20. Now, David Haynes, in his book Natural Theology, cites this passage to show, and I went back to systematic theology and looked it up to see, what's the context and so on. But he shows Van Til denying actual post-lapsarian knowledge of God through nature. So that Van Til saw Paul's words in Romans 1:20 to refer to that knowledge with which Adam had in the original nature and which he lost in the fall. Now, there's two ways to read Van Til here. One is to note his previous use of the words also and on the other hand, as if this guilt was in addition to, that Paul is talking about a guilt in addition to what's ascribed in the traditional view, if you want to be charitable. The other way to read him is the way that Haynes has in his book, which this is page 37 of Natural Theology for that, and in the footnote of where it is in Systematic Theology, or Introduction to Systematic Theology, if you want to look it up. And that can point to the fact that Van Til uses the descriptive term actual knowledge as that which was lost in Adam's sin, which would certainly tend to negate it in the present. So that would be an argument to say that Haynes has read him right. You got to be careful there because, Van Tilians, they're going to say, well, you took it out of context and all that stuff. In the same book, in the Introduction to Systematic Theology, Van Til republished a response to one William Masselink, who had charged Van Til's concept of an ethical antithesis, this idea to imply a total loss of the image of God that negates all natural knowledge. Van Til replied, quote, "All men, even after the fall, know deep down in their hearts that they are creatures of God, that they should therefore obey, but that they have actually broken the law of God. After the fall, therefore, all men seek to suppress the truth infixed in their being about themselves." So it's almost like at first Van Til was going to say, no, I absolutely believe that it's a current after the fall natural knowledge of God, including that they belong to God and that they owe themselves to him and so forth. But then he says, after the fall, therefore, all men seek to suppress the truth, comma, infixed in their being about themselves. What do you mean by infixed? It's like he took back with the left hand what he tried to correct from this critic. So Van Til is distinguishing between, if you're familiar with this thought, a metaphysical antithesis and an ethical antithesis. The idea there is a common ground in natural revelation out there, but because of the ethical antithesis, those two circles on the outside, they're going to suppress, before Christ, they're going to suppress that knowledge entirely. And then between a believer and unbeliever, the unbeliever is going to suppress that completely. And I quote all this to show that the pushback against Van Til has been there from the start, even when he started to write, as has the Van Tilian push right back. In one comment on Romans 1:20, Van Til comes very close to affirming all that we would ask of him to affirm. He says, quote, "As psychologically," where is this from? This has got to be from, let me get the footnote, Introduction to Systematic Theology, page 166. Okay. So he says, "As psychologically self-active creatures, they must see something of the truth." Sounds present tense. "They hold down the truth, to be sure, but it is the truth that they hold down. Nor is it that this truth is objectively placed before them only in nature and in the makeup of man, but knowledge is also in man in the sense that his subjective reaction to that which he sees shows some acquaintance with the truth." How much of a subjective reaction? Can it include discursive reasoning? We don't know. At the very least, Van Til was either confused, contradictory, or speaking in riddles. He's been accused of all. Now, I'd be remiss in closing if I did not cite the thoughts of J. Gresham Machen on this point, partly because he handpicked Van Til to be on his founding faculty at Westminster Seminary, and also partly because of how the liberal view he was attacking at least shares one important similarity with Barth. And so Machen's comments on the knowledge of God are an interesting link. It comes not from a commentary on our passage, but in his chapter on God and Man from his classic Christianity and Liberalism. He was responding to the liberal preachers who would say that we become acquainted with God only through Jesus, right? So, needless to say, Barth was not in his crosshairs writing in 1923. But what is crucial is just how straightforward his words are. Machen's words, back to them. He says this: "For Jesus himself plainly recognized other ways of knowing God. And to reject those other ways is to reject the things that lay at the very center of Jesus' life. Jesus plainly found God's hand in nature. The lilies of the field revealed to him the weaving of God. He found God also in the moral law. The law written in the hearts of men was God's law, which revealed his righteousness. Finally, Jesus plainly found God revealed in the scriptures. But as a matter of fact," is this getting all this? No. I didn't have that note. Good thing I caught it. "But as a matter of fact," Machen says, "when men say that we know God only as he is revealed in Jesus, they are denying all real knowledge of God whatever. For unless there be some idea of God independent of Jesus, the ascription of deity to Jesus has no meaning. To say Jesus is God is meaningless unless the word God has an antecedent meaning attached to it." There's two ways to hear that. Only one right way. There's knowledge of God independent of Jesus. But didn't Jesus say, "I'm the way, the truth, the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me"? That's not what Machen is talking about. He's not talking about many rivers that lead to the same God. That's not what he means. He means there's an antecedent, a referent God, without which the predicate in the sentence "Jesus is God" would not attach itself to anything intelligible. That's a rational precondition of Orthodox Christology, namely Orthodox theology. He's not saying some other contrary theology. But you see how natural theology grounds not only your doctrine of God, but your doctrine of Christ. It grounds your systematic theology. Okay, so this is very, very crucial passage. But before concluding our examination of this foundational text, it should be said that there are three cardinal difficulties for any position that denies that this is objective natural knowledge of God. And I'll close with this. Number one, what exactly is being suppressed and how? So, well, I believe in the end of verse 20. Okay. What exactly is being suppressed and how? Number two, what is the sufficient ground of inexcusability? Sounds like the same question, but in the first one, I'm just going for the mechanism. And number two, what's the actual stuff? So in other words, reason and a thing known in question two. Number three, what exactly is being exchanged in the acts of idolatry that follow? Same thing, but now it's slightly, you see what I'm doing? Three angles on, you're going to need the objective knowledge of God to be in the mind, thought about, not reasoned about. We don't want that. I mean, you're doing acrobats to avoid the obvious and for no good reason. So those are our four questions and those are our answers. As we continue, we'll start to look at all the other biblical passages that help us construct our understanding of what reason and nature are and how God communicates himself through reason and nature.